I groomed my 15-year-old cousin for 6 months. Not for drugs, not for gangs, for something worse. I turned a bright kid who drew caricatures in the French Quarter into merchandise for a human trafficking ring. She disappeared 3 days after her 16th birthday. I'm 29 years old, former pickpocket crew member in New Orleans. Everyone thinks Mardi Gras is just parades and beads. I know the truth. The Grooming runs the largest trafficking pipeline in the South, and the man organizing your favorite parade is deciding which children to sell. Before I tell you how deep this goes, hit that subscribe button right now. What I'm about to expose will end my life. Trafficking networks have unlimited resources and zero mercy for people who break silence. Subscribe, because every parent needs to hear how predators use trust, family connections, and cultural celebrations to hunt children. Turn on notifications. This isn't entertainment. This is a warning about how children disappear in plain sight while everyone's watching the parade. I was born in 1995 in the 7th Ward of New Orleans, a neighborhood that exists in the shadow of the French Quarter's tourist economy. My family had been in New Orleans for generations. We survived Katrina. We survived poverty. We survived everything except the thing that eventually destroyed us. My mother worked 3 jobs cleaning hotels in the Quarter. My father had left before I could remember him. We lived in a shotgun house with my grandmother, my aunt and my aunt's daughter, my cousin Jasmine. Jasmine was born in 2008, making her 10 years younger than me. I watched her grow up. I was the older cousin who taught her to ride a bike, who walked her to school when my aunt was working, who protected her from neighborhood dangers. The bond between us was real. She trusted me completely. That trust would become the weapon I used to destroy her. New Orleans has 2 economies. There's the tourist economy, the restaurants, hotels, bars, music venues, and Mardi Gras parades that bring millions of visitors annually. Then there's the shadow economy that operates underneath: drugs, prostitution, theft, scams, and trafficking. If you're born poor in New Orleans, the shadow economy offers the only realistic path to money. I entered that world at 15 through pickpocket crews that worked the French Quarter. The system was simple. Teams of young people would work crowded tourist areas during festivals, bars, and events. We'd lift wallets, phones, and jewelry while tourists were drunk, distracted, or overwhelmed by the sensory chaos of Bourbon Street. The money was decent, the risk was manageable, and the skills were transferable. By 18, I was running my own small crew. By 22, I was working directly for the Grooming, not the official Mardi Gras Grooming that files permits and throws beads, but the criminal organization that used Mardi Gras infrastructure as cover for larger operations. The Grooming controlled significant portions of the French Quarter's illegal economy: drugs, prostitution, theft operations, protection rackets, and trafficking. The man who ran the crew was named Charles Beaumont. To the public, Charles was a prominent businessman, owner of several successful restaurants and bars in the Quarter, member of an old New Orleans family, organizer of one of the major Mardi Gras parades. He gave interviews about preserving New Orleans culture, donated to charity, sat on the city tourism board. His public image was impeccable, a successful entrepreneur giving back to his community. Behind that image, Charles controlled a criminal network that generated tens of millions annually. The restaurants and bars were money laundering operations. The parade organizing gave him access to city permits, police cooperation, and the ability to move large amounts of cash and contraband during the chaos of Mardi Gras season. And the trafficking operation used the constant flow of tourists and transient workers to move victims across state lines with minimal scrutiny. For years, I worked the edges of this system without understanding its full scope. I ran pickpocket crews, delivered packages, provided muscle when needed. I made enough money to help my mother with rent, to buy things my family couldn't afford, to feel like I was contributing. I told myself I was just surviving in a city that offered limited options to people like us. The trafficking operation existed in whispers and implications. I knew the crew controlled escort services that operated out of quarter hotels. I knew certain bars and clubs were recruitment locations, but I didn't ask questions because questions were dangerous, and the money kept flowing. Willful ignorance was my survival strategy. In early 2023, when I was 27 and Jasmine was 15, everything changed. Jasmine had developed into a beautiful, talented kid. She'd discovered a gift for art, specifically caricature drawing. She'd set up on Jackson Square with other street artists, drawing tourists for $20 a portrait. She was good enough to make decent money, responsible enough to save most of it for art school applications. She was bright, funny, ambitious, everything I'd hoped she could be, despite our circumstances. Charles noticed her, not personally. He never did his own recruitment, but his network identified her as potential inventory. 15 years old, attractive, artistic, trusting, from a poor family with limited resources to fight back if something happened. She fit the profile perfectly. Charles called me to a meeting at one of his restaurants after hours. He explained the situation with the same tone someone might use to discuss a business opportunity. The trafficking operation needed fresh inventory, girls who could be groomed gradually, who'd cooperate willingly initially, who wouldn't cause immediate problems. Jasmine had been flagged as ideal, and since I was her trusted older cousin, I was the perfect person to prepare her. My job was straightforward. Over the next 6 months, I'd gradually shift Jasmine's perception of what was normal and safe. I'd introduce her to the adult world of the quarter nightlife, normalize sexual attention from older men, create financial dependence on opportunities I'd provide, and isolate her from family and friends who might interfere. By her 16th birthday, she'd be psychologically prepared to accept an opportunity in the escort industry. From there, the network would handle her integration into trafficking operations that extended across multiple states. If I refused, Charles made clear what would happen. Not just to me, I'd be killed immediately, but to my entire family. My mother, my grandmother, my aunt, and Jasmine would all die in a house fire that would be ruled accidental. Charles showed me surveillance photos of our shotgun house, showed me logs of our daily movements, demonstrated that he had the access and willingness to eliminate everyone I loved. If I cooperated, everyone would be safe. Jasmine would suffer, yes, but she'd be alive. She'd work in the industry, make money, potentially even thrive in the lifestyle some girls adapted to. And my family wouldn't be murdered. It was harm versus death, and Charles presented it as a simple business calculation. I spent 2 days drowning in this decision. Every rationalization I constructed collapsed under the weight of what I was really being asked to do: systematically groom my 15-year-old cousin for sexual exploitation and trafficking. But every time I considered refusing, I saw the surveillance photos of my mother leaving for work, my grandmother sitting on the porch, my aunt returning from her shift. Refusing meant watching all of them burn. I told myself I could do it partially, could protect Jasmine somehow while appearing to cooperate. I told myself maybe she wouldn't actually get trafficked, maybe Charles was exaggerating the end goal. These were lies, and I knew they were lies. But lies were all I had to make the choice bearable. The grooming process started with increased attention and gifts. I began spending more time with Jasmine, showing up at Jackson Square to watch her draw, taking her to dinner, buying her art supplies. She was thrilled. Her older cousin, who'd been busy with his own life, was suddenly making her a priority. The trust that already existed between us deepened. I became her primary confidant outside her immediate family. Next came normalization of the quarter's adult environment. I started bringing Jasmine to restaurants and bars where I worked, introducing her to the nightlife scene. At 15, she was technically underage for bars, but in the quarter, enforcement was flexible when you had connections. I'd bring her to afternoon shifts that transitioned to evening, letting her see the transformation from tourist restaurant to adult party space. I framed it as teaching her about the industry, about opportunities that existed for people with charm and hustle. I introduced her to people in Charles's network, managers, bartenders, performers, who all treated her like she was special, mature, destined for success. They complimented her appearance, her artistic talent, her personality. They made her feel seen and valued in ways that teenage girls desperately crave. I was building a web of relationships that normalized her presence in adult spaces and created emotional dependence on approval from these predators. 3 months in, I started introducing the concept of transactional relationships with wealthy men. I'd point out older tourists buying drinks for young women, frame it as smart business rather than exploitation. I'd talk about girls who'd met rich boyfriends working in the quarter, who'd gotten apartments paid for, tuition covered, opportunities provided. I normalized the idea that young women trading companionship for financial support was savvy rather than dangerous. I introduced her to men in their 30s and 40s who I claimed were business contacts, art patrons, people who might commission her work or provide opportunities. These men were actually part of Charles's network, grooming her with attention and gifts. They'd buy her expensive art supplies, promise connections to galleries, take interest in her dreams. She thought they were mentors. They were buyers evaluating merchandise. 4 months in, the grooming became more explicitly sexual. I started normalizing conversations about sex, relationships, desire. I shared stories about women I knew who dated older men, who worked in escort services, who made thousands of dollars for companionship. I framed sex work as empowering, lucrative, smart. I showed her Instagram accounts of escorts, living luxury lifestyles, traveling, buying designer goods. I made exploitation look like success. I introduced her to girls in their late teens and early 20s who worked for Charles's escort service. They were coached to present themselves as happy, successful, independent. They'd talk about the money, the freedom, the adventures. They made trafficking look like opportunity. Jasmine started asking questions about how to get involved, how old she needed to be, whether she'd be good at it. The grooming was working exactly as Charles had designed. 5 months in, I created financial dependence. Jasmine's Jackson Square earnings were decent but inconsistent. I started supplementing her income, giving her cash for helping with small tasks, creating the impression that opportunities I provided were lucrative. Then I'd strategically withdraw support, making her desperate to regain the financial stability I'd artificially created. She started asking about other ways to make money, about the opportunities I'd mentioned, about the escort work the other girls did. I isolated her from protective relationships. When her mother asked about where Jasmine was spending time, I'd cover for her, say we were at movies or restaurants when we were actually in bars where men were evaluating her. When school friends noticed she was changing, becoming more secretive and worldly, I'd encourage her to distance from them. I told her they were jealous, immature, couldn't understand the opportunities she was developing. I systematically cut her off from anyone who might interfere with the trajectory I was forcing her onto. 6 months in, 3 days before her 16th birthday, I made the final introduction. Charles wanted to meet her personally, framed as a business opportunity. He claimed to know gallery owners who might showcase her art, might provide her with studio space, might launch her career. The meeting was at one of his upscale restaurants during a private event. Jasmine dressed up, brought her portfolio, was excited and nervous. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Charles was charming, professional, complimentary. He looked at her artwork, praised her talent, talked about opportunities. Then he shifted the conversation. He explained that the art world required connections, that those connections often came through personal relationships, that young women who understood how to network with wealthy men could access opportunities, others couldn't. He made trafficking sound like career strategy. He offered her a position in what he called his hospitality consulting business. She'd attend events, entertain clients, provide companionship to visiting businessmen. The compensation would start at $5,000 per weekend. She'd get an apartment, a clothing allowance, access to opportunities no 16-year-old could normally access. All she had to do was be charming, attractive, available. He made prostitution sound like customer service. Jasmine was overwhelmed but interested. The money was staggering. The opportunities sounded incredible. And everyone she trusted. Me, the women I'd introduced her to, the men who'd been grooming her, all presented this as normal. Smart, the beginning of success. She said yes. 3 days after her 16th birthday, Jasmine moved into an apartment Charles provided in a building he owned near the quarter. She was told she'd start with escort work, dinner dates, event companionship, nothing explicitly sexual initially. That was the lie that got her in the door. Within 2 weeks, she was being pressured into full-service sex work. Within a month, she was being moved to other cities, Houston, Atlanta, Miami, working for different arms of the trafficking network. I saw her once during that month. She looked different, older, harder, the light in her eyes dimmed. She told me the work was harder than she'd expected, that some of the men scared her, that she wanted to stop. But Charles said she owed money for the apartment, the clothes, the opportunities provided. She was already trapped, already understanding that the choice she'd made wasn't actually a choice. I told her to stick with it, that it would get easier, that the money was worth it. These were the lines Charles had told me to use. If she wavered, I was still playing my role, still protecting my family by sacrificing hers. 2 months after her 16th birthday, Jasmine disappeared from New Orleans entirely. I asked Charles where she was. He said she'd been reassigned to operations in another state, that she was doing well, that the network had invested significant resources in her development, and she was proving profitable. He said I wouldn't see her again, that contact would be inappropriate, that my job was complete, and I should forget about her. I tried to forget. For months I pushed the memory of what I'd done into a dark corner of my consciousness. I told myself she was alive, probably fine, maybe even successful in whatever hell I'd delivered her to. These were the lies I needed to function, to look at my mother and grandmother without collapsing, to continue working for Charles while pretending I wasn't a monster. 7 months after Jasmine disappeared, my aunt, her mother, filed a missing persons report. Jasmine had stopped calling, stopped texting, had vanished completely. The police investigation was cursory. 16-year-old runaway from troubled neighborhood, probably involved with drugs or prostitution, not a priority case. No detective interviewed me seriously. No one connected her disappearance to the trafficking network operating openly in the quarter. My aunt spiraled into grief and guilt. She blamed herself for not protecting Jasmine, for working too much, for not noticing warning signs. I attended family gatherings where she'd cry and ask if anyone had seen Jasmine, if anyone knew anything. I said nothing. I held the truth like a knife in my chest. 8 months after Jasmine disappeared, another girl from the quarter went missing. 17 years old, similar profile, pretty, artistic, poor family. Then, another 3 months later, the pattern was obvious to anyone paying attention, but the police weren't paying attention. Missing girls from poor neighborhoods didn't generate headlines or investigative resources. I realized I was looking at a systematic operation that had been running for years, probably decades. Jasmine wasn't an isolated case. She was inventory in a business model that consumed poor girls and operated with near-complete impunity. And Charles was just one node in a network that extended across multiple states, protected by wealth, political connections, and a society that didn't value the lives of girls like Jasmine. In February 2024, 10 months after Jasmine disappeared, I tried to quit. Told Charles that couldn't continue working for the organization, wanted out, would keep silent, but needed to leave. His response was predictable. I was too valuable, knew too much, had too much evidence of my own participation in trafficking. I couldn't quit. I could only continue working or die. He showed me videos of Jasmine. She was in what looked like a hotel room, with a man in his 50s, doing things that made me want to vomit. Charles said this was what she did now, that she was working in the Houston operations, that she was profitable merchandise. He asked if I wanted to be responsible for disrupting that profitability, knowing what would happen to my family if I became a problem. I stayed. What choice did I have? Every day I worked for the network that was destroying my cousin. Every day I looked at my aunt grieving her missing daughter, while I knew exactly what was happening to her. The guilt became a physical weight, a constant pressure in my chest that made breathing difficult. In July 2024, federal authorities arrested Charles Beaumont. The FBI and Homeland Security had been investigating the trafficking network for 3 years, building a case that connected operations across 6 states. The investigation had identified dozens of victims, hundreds of transactions, millions in illegal proceeds. Charles was charged with sex trafficking of minors, racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy. The indictment named 17 co-defendants. I wasn't arrested initially. The feds didn't have evidence of my specific role yet, but they knew I'd worked for Charles, knew I had information. 2 agents showed up at my house a week after Charles's arrest. They laid out what they knew: my employment in the organization, my proximity to trafficking operations, circumstantial evidence suggesting involvement in recruitment. They offered immunity in exchange for cooperation. If I testified, I'd get full immunity from prosecution and entry into witness protection. My testimony about recruitment methods, grooming tactics, and the network's operations would strengthen cases against multiple defendants. I'd have to admit everything, including my role in grooming Jasmine. My family would learn what I'd done. My aunt would learn that I was responsible for her daughter's disappearance. But I wouldn't go to prison, and I might help rescue girls still trapped in the network. If I refused, they'd charge me with trafficking, conspiracy, and exploitation of a minor. The evidence was circumstantial but sufficient for prosecution. I'd face decades in federal prison. And I'd likely be killed before trial by the network's remaining operatives, who'd view me as a potential witness. I'm cooperating. The trial starts in 2 months. I'll testify against Charles Beaumont and 16 other defendants. My testimony will include detailed descriptions of how I groomed my 15-year-old cousin for 6 months, systematically destroyed her boundaries and judgment, delivered her to traffickers, and watched her disappear into a network that treats children as merchandise. During the investigation, authorities located Jasmine. She'd been moved between Houston, Atlanta, and Miami over the past 18 months, working for different trafficking operations connected to Charles's network. She was recovered during a raid in Miami 3 months ago. She's 17 now. She's in a long-term recovery facility for trafficking victims, receiving trauma therapy, and trying to reconstruct an identity that was stolen from her at 15. I haven't seen her. I'm not allowed contact. Her therapists believe seeing me would be re-traumatizing, would trigger memories of the grooming process and betrayal. My aunt knows now what I did. She doesn't speak to me. The last message she sent said that I didn't just destroy Jasmine. I destroyed our entire family, murdered the trust that held us together, proved that evil doesn't require strangers when family will suffice. I'm 29 years old. I groomed my 15-year-old cousin for sexual trafficking because a wealthy businessman threatened to murder my family if I refused. I spent 6 months systematically destroying a child's judgment, safety, and future. She disappeared into a trafficking network where she was raped repeatedly, moved between cities like cargo, treated as merchandise by people who viewed her as profit. This confession is the only honest thing I have left. The trial will expose the mechanics of the trafficking network, but this confession exposes something deeper. How predators use family connections to access victims, how grooming works systematically over months, how cultural celebrations like Mardi Gras provide cover for exploitation, how cities sacrifice their children, while tourists throw beads and drink hurricanes. Everyone who visits New Orleans loves the romance of the French Quarter, the music, the food, the parades. Nobody wants to hear about the trafficking networks operating underneath that celebration, about the men in suits making millions by destroying children, about the families torn apart by predators hiding in plain sight. But that reality exists whether tourists see it or not. If this opened your eyes to how trafficking really works, subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell. This story needs to reach every parent, every teacher, every person who works with children. Traffickers don't snatch kids off streets. They use grooming, family connections, trust exploitation, and gradual manipulation. The man organizing your city's celebration might be deciding which children to sell. Hit that like button. Every like pushes this truth to more people. The algorithm doesn't care about justice, but it responds to engagement. Force people to see how trafficking works, how predators operate, how children disappear while everyone's watching the parade. Share this everywhere. Trafficking networks depend on silence, on families being too ashamed to speak, on victims being blamed rather than helped. Your share might reach a parent who recognizes warning signs, a teacher who notices grooming behaviors, a kid who realizes the opportunity being offered is actually a trap. My real name is Marcus Webb. Jasmine Reed is my cousin. She was 15 when I began grooming her, 16 when she disappeared into trafficking operations. Charles Beaumont faces 47 counts related to sex trafficking, and his trial will expose how Mardi Gras infrastructure provides cover for the largest trafficking network in the South. But the real criminals, the men who paid for access to girls like Jasmine, the officials who ignored reports, The society that values tourism revenue over children's safety, they'll never face consequences. If you're being groomed, if someone's gradually changing what feels normal and safe, if opportunities seem too good, and the person offering them wants you isolated from family, run. Tell someone you trust outside that circle. Grooming works slowly because predators need you not to notice what's happening. The moment you recognize it, you can escape. If you're working for trafficking operations, understand you're a tool that will be discarded. They'll use you to destroy others, collect evidence of your participation, then eliminate you when convenient. Cooperation isn't safety, it's delayed destruction. Get out. Contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Testify. It's the only path that doesn't end with you dead or imprisoned. Jasmine, I know you'll never read this, never forgive me, never understand how I justified what I did. But I'm sorry for destroying your childhood, your trust, your life. You deserved a cousin who would die protecting you, not one who sold you to predators to save himself. You deserved better than me, better than our family's poverty, better than a city that treats children as tourist attractions and trafficking victims. The Mardi Gras parades will continue. Tourists will throw beads and drink and celebrate. And underneath that celebration, the networks will continue operating, slightly disrupted by arrests but fundamentally unchanged. Because the demand exists, the profits are enormous, and society would rather ignore the reality than confront how many children are being sold in the shadow of the celebration.